I met Anthony James, or AJ as he's more commonly referred to, at the end of last year when he was in Sydney working on a project with my husband. We instantly bonded over the fact that he has the same name as my dad, Anthony James, not AJ. My dad definitely doesn't go by AJ. And yeah, as soon as we kind of started chatting, he was asking those in-depth life questions, and I could see why his podcast, the Regeneration Podcast, is so successful. You know, he has such a kind of warm and open nature that, yeah, you just want to chat and have that conversation with him. His podcast is all about the ways in which we can regenerate ourselves, the planet, our systems, and he speaks to guests who are both leaders in that space and also people working kind of grassroots, ground up, to make that change. I was a little bit nervous going into recording this podcast purely because, you know, this is what AJ does full time for a living. But of course, because AJ is just, yeah, he's lovely and open and warm and really actually super supportive about what I'm doing, which has been so lovely. It was obviously just a great conversation. We talk a lot about kind of his journey and the fact that it hasn't been linear. And two kind of phrases that really stick out from this conversation are following the cues and the kind of strange and unknown ways in which life can unfold, and being oblivious to options. AJ uses this phrase when talking about his own life, but I think it's a really nice phrase, I think, and lens to look through things when we think about our own lives, but also how we approach problems and solutions and things as a collective, is not being oblivious to the enormous actually amount of options that we have. So I will link to his website and podcast and everything in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy, and as always, get something out of it. We often define ourselves by kind of what we do rather than, you know, who we are and kind of our ways of being. And often what we do isn't aligned with, you know, our values and our ways of being. But I get the sense from you that that's not the case, that your doing is very much or more kind of aligned with your being and, you know, your value system. So I'm curious, if someone asked you today, what do you do? How would you kind of answer that question?
That is a great question, because I have faltered on it a bit in recent times, and partly because if I was to say podcaster, I still laugh, I still chuckle. Can that be serious? Unless you're just a influencer, if it was betray my language, unless you're an influencer or that sort of celebrity-ish thing, that doesn't feel true. So I was like, am I a podcaster? I don't know if I'm a podcaster, because I haven't set out to be a podcaster either, right? It's just through circumstance and trying things with that overall ethos that you've nailed, you've described beautifully. That's been the aspiration, but like for decades. So whatever I've done, be it music back in the 90s to living in Central America for a few years after that, to teaching in sustainability at uni and other things on the journey, and then trying this, it was all led by certainly a fundamental belief, sort of a first principles belief that you just articulated, that there should, how can you possibly live with the distinction between those things? Like, what would be the point? So we could go into greater detail about really that's why after the band ended that I was in, that I took off for Central America, because I was like, I'm so sick. I mean, I had to fend for our musical lives with other income from just whatever you could get at times, and some funny things on the journey, and not all bad, like some really interesting things, but, you know, from laboring and landscaping to factories to modeling, like a crazy incoherent spread of things, but to try and keep the main thing going. And by the time that ended, I thought, I'm so sick of that, the cycle of earning, spending, and not getting to the heart of your values. So I thought, I'm going to go where I'm probably quintessentially going to be of some value, a poor place, but somewhere where I felt this draw and this call. And then I'm literally going to offer myself up. I'm yours if you can give me a room and board and room and food, like basically cover my expenses. And to cut a very long story short, that happened the third destination in, which was in rural Guatemala. And it was driven with this overarching drive, though, that you've articulated here. How do you collapse that gap, which this sort of, our culture's sort of created for a lot of people, where it's a struggle to get out of it? I mean, it feels like good fortune in that context, but obviously I put a lot of years of heart and soul into it to be in a position where I can, there is no gap there. But blessedly, even today, you find that comes around because everybody else who wants to gift into you, which comes from how much you want to gift into others. So that cycle kicked in toe. And I was 30 before I realized it. Coming from a background where I was groomed for business, that actually the key was to gift, and then everyone looks to gift to you. You create a whole thing around you. And here I am with a listener-supported podcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so did you, when you were kind of in business or studying business, did you always feel that something was off or iffy?
Oh, dying
Right.
on the inside. 100%. I got as far as, doing what I was supposed to do, award or two here and there, scholarship to university with all the big banks and retailers behind it, and a breaking thing at the time, business systems. It was organizing the systems of business and coding them, sort of the whole kit. And it'd be the sort of thing where they cut 10% of this or 20% of the students every year type of thing, like brutal. And somehow a lot of my early time in this dying soul period was just winging my way through with a decent memory to pass exams and stuff, but really not much understanding and certainly no passion. I finished that degree, and I reckon I knew about 10% of the knowledge that might have been on offer. That you could go through 21 years of education and ace it and not know much was like, what is that?
Yes, or even be that interested in it sounds like.
Well, that was obviously the problem, the core problem. And so for me, it was really a process of, pretty deep depression at one stage, halfway through that degree. But then, again, luck, light switched on, finished the degree, knew I would then pivot. And so I went and did a gym instructor course and became a triathlete while I started to take music seriously. And there began life, or my life, if you might say. So late to the party, but made up time, made up ground a little bit to that ultimate goal, really, of just, can you live out your value set? Yeah, your care. Can that be your first port of call every day, first and last port of call every day?
And when you were in Guatemala, were you teaching music?
Yeah, it's a funny thing because when I left, I sold everything. It was a one-way ticket. I don't see what happens. I'm just getting out of this, and it was a strong call at the time too, to go to that area. I didn't know exactly where I'd end up, obviously. The funny thing was, because I'd sold everything, car, kit, and everything that meant less than those two things. And then, except actually for my treasured 7mm Navy diving suit that my mum proceeded to lose half of while I was away. So that didn't work either, lost that too. But when I got to Guatemala or got to this place, and the reason then that it just synced in from the get-go is partly because they had money from I think it was a Dutch funding agency at the time, to set up a music school and no one to do it. And so I've rocked up to this place and said, I'm yours. What can you use me for? And they've said, well, we've got this funding. Can you set up the music school? And I was like, what do you know? And so they said, yeah, can you get like guitars and keys and flutes and whatever? And I said, do you want drums too? And like, oh, drums, yeah, yeah. I'm like, cool, because I was mostly a drummer. I mean, I dabbled in the other stuff. I could teach it, but I was mostly a drummer. And yeah, definitely La Batteria for sure. And so I went and got all of that and put together this school. And then, as per everything else that was going on, you then proceed to build a culture of interest around it, recruit teachers, have the system take hold, right? And then that became part of a larger cultural center that I would play increasingly that sort of mediator, facilitator role with a library in it that then involved the schools and then involved the villages around the town and then went towards a radio station that ended up being an Indigenous Mayan woman community radio station. So after I left, I played a lot of sort of part of the momentum towards that type of role over the few years, and then I felt the call to come home. But yeah.
And I remember when we met at the end of last year, you talking about kind of being in Guatemala and very much being part of that community and the place that you were in. I remember asking, oh, did you travel much while you were there? And you saying, no, like I actually spent most of my time there. Coming from Australia and then being kind of quite entrenched in a good way in a community like that, was it completely different to what you had known kind of growing up in the places you'd been before in the sense of what community was, or kind of what was that experience like really being a big part of that community?
Oh, incredible. I mean, the first thing to say is, I don't know if we got to this detail when we spoke the first time, but that feeling really peaked in my second year there. I was there a further year, but something shifted at the end of the second year. That's when I started to feel home calling. And I was like, what do you know? What's this? Wow. For really the first time ever as Australia. And it's a funny thing because in fact, I think I had paid zero attention. And, where I was and internet hadn't really landed there. I was playing a little role in getting some public internet there because a couple of private providers had bobbed up at rates no one could afford except the, tiny fraction. And then as the library grew, I helped get monitors and internet into that at the time. I mean, it went at pace after this time, but so I didn't even know. I kept no tabs, and in many ways was unable to keep tabs on Australia. Didn't hear of the Bali bombing, for example, until a teacher runs down the street saying, Antonio, I've just heard on Discovery Channel, or whatever it was that he got on cable, because he was one of the counsellors too. So just very few people in town had this sort of, he running down the street telling me about the Bali bombing a month after it or something. So it hadn't been on my radar at all, but then it just started to bubble up on the inside. And I started to feel kinship with Shane Warne, which I've never forgotten because he was never my favourite player or compatriot, but I started to feel that I was going to say, and cliche to say it, but that we're all one as a people. But I think this is what comes when you tap your deepest sensibility, right? And have space to do that, which of course I had in the absence of all the hubbub of information and internet and whatever. And so I felt these deeper feelings and insights and then, yeah, that then though, funnily enough, absolutely clear as crystal, changed everything there. Because I started to have an end in mind and it was never the same after that. But before that, when I wasn't going anywhere, at least not intending to, the amount that people invested in me as time went on and trust built was so humbling and beautiful and amazing to feel. And no, I hadn't felt that before. The band was the closest because it was that's your classic sort of brotherhood. We were all blokes. that we formed, and it was all about each other as much as anything else. And we'd lead the, we were happy to be touring the country and the world. It didn't matter if we made anything similarly, as long as we didn't, we could do it. We found a way to do it. Then awesome. That was a life well lived. And sure enough, we look back on those days as priceless and precious. Then these two experiences essentially became my benchmark of belonging and of living your value set. Yeah.
Yes. And as you were telling that story, two things popped into my mind. Like the first being, I wonder if that feeling of connection back to Australia was almost able to happen because, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were feeling more connected to yourself, because you were teaching music and doing all of these things. So yeah, you were able to feel that connection back. And then also I remember someone saying once, not when you have a community, say, or you live in kind of a place where you know everyone and you're reliant on each other, it means that you have to be kind of the best version of yourself, or you have to kind of work through problems that you may have with someone or whatever, because you're not just getting up and going or not speaking to the neighbor, So I think that's also quite an interesting perspective, realizing that you're actually like a fundamental part of something means that you want to kind of put your best foot forward.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, but in so many ways. I'll never forget when they set me up with a little room down in a disused dorm and a tab at the local commie or the local restaurant. And I got started, on those direct tasks. It became more middleman and stuff later, but and arrangements then with that municipality shifted. But I'll never forget, that feeling of how best to say, when they accepted the premise that I put to them, put me up, and we got started. And I was in a meeting with about 40 different stakeholders. And it was the first setting then that everyone was going about their work and not addressing me directly. And my Spanish wasn't that good, much less my Mayan Kekchi. And I was a lost puppy. And I've held my face, but then got back to my room and cried, thinking, what the hell have I done? And what the hell am I doing? And who am I kidding? And so there's that. And then on the other hand, there's, being a laughing stock as a minority who couldn't speak the language for the next 2 months, but it fast-tracked it. In 2 months I could. But that feeling, some days you didn't want to go out onto the street and get breakfast because you just can't do it again. And then another side of it, coming out of, it's not civil war, colonial conquest and defense, so-called civil war, CIA orchestrated stuff, quintessential of that period in that region, to come out of that, having just come out of that, and then I'm lobbing in. I learned later, there's one guy in particular sort of emblematic of it, who I learned later was highly suspicious of me, essentially took me for a plant, because why else would you do all this for nothing, for example? So I guess to indeed be present and end up, for example, where it works and these people become friends, or at least there's respect, and in some cases great friends, and then even that senior fellow, as I left, we have a chat and he divulges this and says, I was wrong. Hats off to you. Yeah, to be present through that and is there anything more rewarding than that? Far out. With people who didn't have to accept you in any way. Yeah, much less with that colonial backdrop that was, very much alive and kicking. Yeah, so that's amazingly beautiful. And of course, it sets you up not only for yourself, but for others in similar positions. Back here, where I'm the white, resourced enough fella. I mean, I live below the poverty line, but I'm obviously not destitute, as the character in my favorite film Into the Wild says. I got a college degree. I'm not destitute. I choose to live like this. So that's the difference, right? And to then see and empathize with those who are not, first and foremost, the first peoples of this country, who incredibly, despite the sophistication of their cultures, are still regarded as fringe and treated as fringe. When you learn how sophisticated and remarkable and needed their knowledge is, and their heart is, and their spirit is, notwithstanding the issues, right, that can be acute and difficult. I've been in places where crime and violence amongst mob, let alone across cultures, is very freaking difficult on an immediate level. So I empathize for that too. But the fact that we know they're symptoms of the same beast, though. So yeah, so not the least that, but of course then migrants, refugees there, and just any marginalized group that you've been there and had to do this, taught me a hell of a lot.
It's interesting you brought that up because just earlier, Dave and I were talking about like our First Nations people and I guess some of the issues you face. And like you're saying, things like crime and addiction, things, they exist. But I think they exist because those groups of people are so far removed from the way that they want to and should be living, like connected to the land, that of course that stuff happens because they're placed in these environments which do not align to the way that they want to be living.
No, and when things got really dark for me, so I'm about 19, right, before the light switched on, with complete luck, but perhaps relevant to this too, how it happened. I was so oblivious to options. Like it was just dark. So all I knew was what I didn't like, what didn't do anything for me. And there was nothing to go to, which from the outside, for anyone who knew me, would have looked ridiculous. There was music, there was ocean. But I wouldn't even move to the ocean. I didn't even know to move back. You know, the family had moved away. Dad unilaterally really had moved us away. Could have and did eventually. When I had the light switched on, first thing I did was get to the bay. I was in Melbourne at the time playing music and stuff and finishing that degree. So I got to the bay at least, and then I'm going, oh my God, why wasn't I here from the get-go? Like as soon as I got on my own steam, why did I move to Clayton to be near Monash? Get to the coast. But anyway, there I was, and that was part of it. And really what switched the lights on, though, was an accidental journey back home to Perth because Dad had moved us away. When I was 8, he put a line under it and said, we're not moving back. And that killed me. But by 19, it's long forgotten that I should go back to country, you could even say, you know, if I can claim that terminology around this. And the fact that even getting to saltwater at the bay spoke to me a bit, and getting back to Perth at 19, which wasn't my choice, by the way. It was offered to me in a very ironic, interesting way. And that turns the light on. I come back, and after a period, though, I stayed and fed the soul a bit, but then came back, finished the degree, and then got onto that path. But what I saw, though, then, out of all that was how it can look like, why don't you just bloody get your act together from the outside? And from the inside, you're like, if only I could see. Like, I can't. But I didn't even know to say I can't see the options. You're just in the dark. And then secondly, the fact that what triggered it for me, and I know this is true for a lot of First Nations folk, some of it's been on the podcast, you know, even with elders who've got the courts to have, instead of sending kids to remand, they get them down to country and hold the hearings on country and let them play out whatever time is deemed necessary on country. These stories where it does for them what it did for me and switch the lights on, from which then you can see choices all of a sudden. So yeah, 100% that's a massive, if not the STEM factor.
Yes, 100%. And I guess this segues nicely, but like, so would you, if we just look, I guess, at the state of things generally, so huge, massive thing, one of the biggest things that I see kind of as a barrier is this kind of like siloed way of thinking, or, you know, not root cause way of thinking or not looking at things holistically. Obviously, you're quite adept at kind of systems thinking in that entire world. What do you think about it? Like in terms of what systems thinking is, and if we had more of that kind of outlook, what would, huge question, but what would kind of the world look like and what would the solutions be?
You know, I'm reminded of Kate Rayworth when she was my third guest on the podcast just after Donut Economics came out. And I'm reminded that I think we spoke about some life stuff as well first, but then when we got not far in, we're getting to the grunt of the book and everything. And I said pretty much the same question. And she said, well, that's the book, really. Because it's so big. Of course, it's going to be more in an elaborated thing. But I guess the first thing to say is, like, I think my disposition and through all that searching and stuff early days was perhaps towards this. But the moment of crystallization and a body of knowledge to tap into and develop with came after, as the band was ending. Again, complete chance. I didn't choose this. So much of it is like this, right? So that's relevant to say, I think, that the band was ending, but not quite. So I wasn't yet taking off to Central America. And my partner at the time enrolls in a Master's in Environmental Science, which just happens to be led by a legend called Professor Frank Fisher, who had done this, pioneered systems thinking in Australia from the 70s. He was the Australian port of call, or one of the key ones, connected with all the big international ones, the Batesons and Capras and Mataranas, and I could go on. And people like Ivan Illich, even, key intellectuals from the 70s, terrific legacy. And I saw this and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Band hadn't quite packed up. This partner of mine not only was had enrolled in it, but she managed enrollments at the uni. And in those days, you had to enroll like months out. She put me into the system without going through the process the week before as it starts. So I sneak in through the back door, so to speak. And he ends up being a key friendship and mentor. And that was the year 2000. I still feel the urge to go to Guatemala. So I leave after a mere 6 months, but the bond, let alone the kernel, had been formed, and that remained. We ended up teaching together 10 years after that, and then he sadly died in 2012. And then I became the holder of his legacy in at least material ways, and obviously some broader ways that I share with others. But I have his material, and I'm forming a book around some of that at the moment to do it as much justice as I can. But so I managed to lob in again to that legacy, and then have had 2 decades plus of practicing it, in a way since, including obviously on the ground in places. And how would I describe? I think this is a really important question. Perhaps what I can say about it in a nutshell is that, yes, part of what we're talking about in general at this level is changing systems that we live by, that we discreetly compartmentalize, as you've alluded to, economy and agriculture and whatever. And so that's one level, and that's important. In the podcast I host, as you know, I say the catch cry, if you like, is changing the systems and or actually regenerating the systems and stories we live by, because the arrogance of thinking that we regenerate the earth itself and life itself, that's part of the mechanistic conquer the universe, master the universe thing, worldview that we're emerging from and need to emerge from. So you can't perpetuate. I mean, this is a large part of the practice. When I said the word practice before, this is it, as much in yourself, if you're going to maintain instrumentalist control mechanistic metaphors in your own mind and language, I mean, they're revealed in your language, in your mind, then that's part of what keeps us in this pickle, I think, is that they're persistent for good reason. They bed down deep into our intellectual and social structures, and we can unwittingly perpetuate in our efforts to change stuff, make, because that's an instrumentalist wish to shift the world. So I think perhaps the best answer I can give in short terms to your question is that when I say shifting this, regenerating the systems and stories we live by to enable regeneration of life on Earth, so that it does it for itself in each of us and the land and oceans, etc., is that it's between the systems. It's the connection. It's the even connection. I love how Norman Bateson even sort of calls out that language around interconnectedness, because that still implies discrete parts you can connect and disconnect and put back and whatever. She says it's more like a soup. The living world is more like a soup. You're not going to be interconnecting anything. It's a total blend, right? So to extract or to disconnect anything is to render it essentially dead, or at best alone, like fragmented. So I think that's the key thing about systems thinking, really, because I see a lot of people talk systems thinking, but they're actually talking about the isolated systems that we would put a name to. But it's actually the broader body of thought, like where it came from and stuff, is around the interconnections and the bits in between, and ultimately the mishmash. And how do you live in that complexity, which is what complex adaptive systems, this sort of language, which is where the language of emergence comes from, that you don't control it. You don't even seek to change or fix the thing that's right in front of your face. You look around it. What's it emerged from? And you delve and you play and you practice in that space with each other and ferment the conditions out of which all sorts of amazing surprises. Like, I mean, we've heard in my own life, I didn't choose. My fixes weren't to go and be with Frank, or to be with that partner who would take me to Frank that particular way, or to go to Perth at that time. Like, how much was life my fixes, my choosing in a linear fashion? It just doesn't work that way. Beautifully, it doesn't work that way. But we have to get that, or we keep unintentionally worsening.
That's interesting.
Everything. Yeah.
Yes. It's I never thought about it like that, but it's quite a beautiful way of looking at the solutions, but also just a way to kind of live, like a philosophy of living life, right?
It's exactly what hit me. It resolves all sorts of dilemmas, like right full circle back to where we started. It resolves all sorts of dichotomies that don't exist, right? It's our mental frameworks that create them. They don't exist in reality. So our mind then dissolves what we've created that separates ourselves from the way the world works. And that ultimate sense of belonging, connection to country, whatever you want to say.
Mm.
And then so personally it does that. And then of course, by extension, it relieves us of the pressure of fixing stuff. And then puts the understanding that nature's at your back, so to speak. The wind is at your back, because the way the world works is this way. If you can get in sync with it, then how we met was through your husband, Dave, and we've both, of course, been in different professional settings and had our paths converge on regenerative agriculture to a degree. And that's everything they all tell you too, right? About how they realized land and production works. It's the way life works in its naturally regenerative seeking patterns. Yeah, so it changes the goal. The goal is to get in flow with that, from which it all flows, rather than think, oh my God, we have to fix this, or we have to conquer this, or we've got to beat this, or we've got to get this through, or whatever it might be.
And I think you sort of touched on it before, but that need to fix, or believing that we can even fix it, is just about, control and almost ego and being above the thing, be it nature, so it's
100%. But, I use the word practice advisedly, like I'm still practicing.
I was going to ask you, like, I guess, like how that looks for you in the way that you live your life. I mean, from the kind of your story, I get the sense you sort of just follow those cues, or the little like, oh, I'm getting a sense I should go here, and you kind of follow those little whatever you want to call it. Yeah, but the cues.
Yes, that is true. And it's so unambiguously understood by myself even now because the podcast is this weekly manifestation of it. I would never have expected that it would have gone here. You know, it came from getting out on country to speak to people. That was express starting point and goal, to get to know my country, and in ways that I had never remotely. But most of the country is out of cities, and people out there obviously tending large landscapes, and some of them incredibly well. So I was like, okay, got to go learn from these stories and meet the people doing it and understand my country. All walks of life out there. And not to the exclusion of cities, but obviously including the whole. And so that has continued. Listeners have started to support it. Well, had started to support it and continue to support it. So it is so a manifestation of that unequivocally now. So yes, my life is a more flowing version of that aspiration, having worked at it and held those benchmarks that, you know, from time ago, that I just knew this was true. I didn't have to believe it. I had experienced it, that you get in a position where whens and ifs in your life, that they just disappear and you're there. This is it. But perhaps the best thing I can articulate to perhaps express an answer to your question that you led off with about how I practice it today is that I've recently been in this acute edge locally here at our base, which is the home I was luckily returned to when I was 19, which is the coast in Perth, Scarborough. And right now, there is, well, I guess I view it as another manifestation of the incumbent powers and systems doubling down, which they're essentially doing everywhere. Because the solution, right, the fix to our problems isn't to change, if you're of that mind, it's to ramp it up. We're just not going fast enough. We're not growing fast enough. We don't have the tech yet. But when we do, we'll be right. You know, all that. So we're doubling down. The juggernaut is hastening its destruction. And it is manifest around Perth and around Scarborough like you wouldn't believe. And whether I'm talking about road expansions, just wiping out life en masse, whether I'm talking about what's happening here locally, which is manifesting in approvals of 25-story, 18-story, 17-story glass skyscrapers on precious, fragile sand systems that is our coast, right? They're not even rocky and stable. And meanwhile, I'm watching the coast erode because I live right on the coast, right? We've lost 10 meters in the last 3 years, and it doesn't even rate a mention in these plans and proposals, but they're getting through. And it's because the planning system doesn't even plan anymore. It quite literally in this case, but I know it's partly true in Sydney too, where you're speaking from, that the planning frameworks that are actually still in place, that do exist here, for example, are just being ignored. We are literally in a developer-led, ad hoc, who knows what's coming next, who even knows what the rules are. Some developers have cottoned on and gone, well, I'll just propose this then. And how about this? 43 stories over here, which was the one that didn't get up so far, but that was back a bit, so they'll be emboldened. And that argument that we need a plan, all the more if we're going to dramatically alter places on an eroding foreshore at this time in systems change era and where everything's, you know, really screaming at us, that the idea that doesn't even hold water, it's good luck trying to find a rep that will even take that on or understand it. And that then the planning system just happens with strangers, unelected, unaccountable in this way. So I articulate that partly as a way that perhaps will help listeners identify with whatever their local things are or whatever's just reaching them and darkening their hearts a bit. That I'm in an acute edge of that. I've been presenting to these state agencies just this week to try and say something as basic and common sense as, can we just make a plan? Not even, I don't like this, can we do something different? Just, can we make a plan and get a vision that we then know where each other stands on? And that has been seriously getting me down. Yeah, my place is being destroyed. So how do I practice? I guess it's a way of saying, Ing, that my practice, when I'm confronted with this, right, and I'm thinking at the one hand, how can I stop this from happening? So I present to the state agency. I write to them. I call my counsellors. You do this thing to confront this particular thing right in front of you. So it's a linear approach, right? So it's not to say you don't do that, but you'll find your sustenance and ultimately your success in the culture that we develop together that shifts those things in the longer term, which will mean, yes, there are more losses. There will be more losses, but it's not, we won't stop them by resigning ourselves and much more butting our heads against the walls of linear approaches.
So you're obviously, living in the real world, seeing things like this happen and destruction and just, decisions being made that aren't necessarily the best for, the people and the planet. But at the same time, you're having conversations with people who are kind of doing the opposite in terms of solutions and all about regeneration. How do you almost reconcile almost the good and the bad in very simplistic terms? And also, where does your almost like hope versus pessimism kind of sit?
I think that's the practice. I think, and all the more in these times, these last couple of weeks, I've honed in on, because the former is is real too, right? It's real, and I still come across stuff like, just even, when was it, a day or two ago, I had a chat with Tanya Massey. So the Massey family, right? Tanya and I have a chat. And that afternoon, they're going to harvest with Black Duck Foods, Bruce Pascoe's mob, and Native Foodways. So there's and there's someone else, a few Indigenous social enterprise outfits, if you want to call them that, are going to the Massey farm to harvest kangaroo grass and other ancient grains for, I guess, the first time in 200 years or something. Mm. Amazing. And, in a context where bush foods are going off, but it's only 1% owned by Indigenous people. I mean, that's it. And that's just happening unannounced, no media coverage. I just happen to be talking to her on the day, let alone the stuff I find out about and put on a podcast. Like, this is happening everywhere, like extraordinary, top shelf, not even just, oh, that's kind of nice. Imagine if there was more of that. Like, this is amazing stuff that's seriously game changing. And it's happening all the time everywhere. The fact that I've got friends, like relationships that feed at that level and feed each other at that level now. And yes, I have this media portal that shares it. And so can go to other places that you ordinarily wouldn't. Speaking to, I don't know, Carol Sanford, that drew extraordinary response. An international who's worked in regenerative stuff, for decades, well before everyone was saying the word. Which is partly, by the way, why the podcast has the play on the word, to always be reflexive and look back on itself. This is not jargon here, and the word is up for critique, but the language is not it.
I love that, because you don't want that word to just get hijacked.
Well, it probably will, Ing. This is the thing, but to understand that and not get lost in the symbols, don't get lost in the symbols or of what counts, which includes language, right? I mean, language is beautiful, but it's not the thing. It's not life. It's we speak in metaphor. That's how we conceptualize and speak. And that's how we can understand the stories and the ways of thinking we're trying to change, is that our language will reveal it through its metaphors. And you can go, okay, I'm still thinking mechanistically about that. I might change. And what language would do that or help do that? But not to get lost in the fact that the language is it. So don't never get too attached to sustainability. Or that's why I spend zero time on debates around is regen ag the term to use or not. I don't care. Can we get over ourselves and just tap into the fact that there is a wave of people who care, who are inspired by what's actually happening, and build on that together. And so, yeah, to back to your questioning, I think it's no wonder that if you just focus on the linear battle, so to speak, I mean, that's what you end up getting into, that kills your spirit. Well, at least most of us. Some are perhaps are the warrior spirits, and bless them in that way. But I think most of us are going to want to tap into the vein of life that is exemplified in these people and these ways and these things that then just emerge. Who predicted this? Nobody could have. And that's the way it will go. And being part of that is rich. So then I don't even worry about, again, false dichotomies of hope and not hope and good and bad. And you just get in the flow and you give your best. Like, should I bother ringing this counsellor today, or should I actually just do a podcast with you? I chose this, by the way.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So as a case in point, like a very mundane choice in a day, it probably is good that I call this counsel and have this conversation, but actually this is going to be more important, I think.
Yeah. And also what you just said about like people and connection and the importance of that, I think that also is relevant to what you were saying about not getting too fixated on, say, the label of like regen ag, because at the end of the day, it's actually, if we say had a relationship with the people where we were getting our food from, we don't need a label about the food because we can have that conversation.
Oh, Ing, if my old mentor was around right now, he's a professor, so keep this in mind. He'd say HD.
Oh, really? Amazing.
Totally. I'll never forget it. It's beautiful. He used to hate Heart Foundation tick boxes and traffic light systems, on labeling and stuff. He used to hate it. And I remember contemplating this for a while, trying to really get it, And, you still hear a lot of people saying, this will make it easier for people to understand or whatever. No, it makes it easier for people not to understand. And much less not to connect in this way, not to actually get to know and feel each other and the land that your food's made on, etc. So 100%. And then not only that, but on offer is great sustenance in not only then the food you eat, but the relationships you have and the land you'll see and feel coming back. And it won't be that far away, right? Because that's part of the thing. It's only 200 Ks or maybe less, but in WA, it's only 200 Ks up the road. There are plans afoot to perhaps get warehouse outlets that bring it closer to the city, but that's again next level shifts in these systems. And so much of what I'm learning, I think, these days is like this in all domains, is that it doesn't actually come from trying to shift an incumbent system. Yeah, it is just go and create. And it's not detached. Like, again, it's not dichotomized. So it's not mutually exclusive, but you go, here's the flow. And bang, this has appeared as a possibility. Oh my God, this is something that's going on right now, right? So it's like, this is why I was talking to Tanya. I'm like, Tanya's going to need, and she's going to have input on this for sure. And then someone else will get this flank, and is it going to emerge? I don't know. Maybe something else will emerge. This is the beautiful stuff that can really feed your soul. And if you believe, as I do, and I hear from a lot of people I respect, that getting to know our places is the most important thing, be they utility services or where your water's from, the people there and the land and how it speaks to you, and you speak to it all the time. And if that's the most important thing, to shift the conditions out of which everything arises, then there you are.
So would you say that's a common sort of thread throughout all of these conversations that you have, just generally, but also on the podcast, that's a really prominent theme?
It's almost number one, except I bet you could tell me two other key points that I'd say, oh yeah, that's almost number one too. But it's right up there amongst the key threads, which of course is the stuff that fascinates me. And after 150 episodes or so, the episodes themselves then go into, oh, this thread from that, and this thread that's emerged over that era, or in that time, or from that region, mapping onto this one. And you get to really sense those, so I deliberately won't say interconnections. I'll just say, synchronicities or synergies maybe, or harmonies.
Like if you it's sort of broken down like that, it's also a very achievable and simple way of doing things.
Who knew that? And this is again, well, there you go. Another one of the key threads, right? But it's all part of the one thread ultimately, isn't it? Is that, well, in the words of a recent podcast guest late last year, Karen O'Brien, on quantum social change, right? This brilliant professor theorist, but in such a way as to be so accessible in speaking to people about this stuff, that the title of her book was "You Matter More Than You Think." It's that you actually, the way you are right now, where you are, you don't need anything else. You don't need to study anything else. You don't need to have a qualification. You don't need any new tech. You don't need to move. You don't need to change job. Like nothing. You right now matter more than you think, because you're in the perfect position to do everything we've been speaking about. And that, if that is it, then bang, there we all are right now.
Yeah. And how empowering is that for people, because you're not waiting on XYZ thing.
Exactly. Anybody to tell you or do it for you. Oh, this is massive, isn't it? I mean, the way that the system goes on, the way that these development agencies persist with, and I'll say corrupt, not necessarily, although maybe in money changing hands and whatever, but corrupt just in the sense that it's not moral and it's not accountable and it's not right. It's not connected to any democratic structure. So in those ways, corrupt. The only way they can do it is with people who take the cue from that there's nothing they can do or they're locked out.
And it goes from the fight to the build, and they're two very different kind of intentions.
Totally. I mean, how often do it's almost a laughing point for most people who are remotely sort of think in this way to go, oh, the war on everything, war on, drugs and bloody whatever we don't like. There's a war, and nature's war on us when a flood happens or whatever. That BS. But those battle metaphors, oh my God, do they persist? Yeah, but that's the adversarial dichotomized mindset just revealing itself still. So, yeah, that you go from the fight, and what was the positive metaphor you used? To the build. So I'd even use, build, yeah, probably means something to designers and stuff, but it goes back to Kate Raworth in a way. She used the metaphor of gardening and to go from the Newtonian tools, the engineering metaphors to the gardening, where sure you've got your secateurs and stuff, but you're really tending. You don't know what's going to happen when you do this or whatever. More that tending life metaphor.
And building is also more of that, maybe conquer or, control kind of.
That's what I worry about. I even spoke to Paul Hooken, who's got this great chapter on buildings, right, and cities in Regeneration, the book. And I had to put to him a couple of things in the book, in the podcast, that were like, for example, that we need 8 New York cities, like despite all these great advances in building materials and, hemp and, even timber again, even bamboo, like amazing stuff. You're really, wow. But that we need 8 New York cities equivalent a month globally if we are to shift to accommodate the world in the sorts of structures that we want to. And I said, isn't that going to be classic? As more of us are starting to cotton onto, I think, even with the renewable stuff, isn't that going to hasten the cliff edge arrival in our efforts to flip everything out? And he said, yeah, if you crunch the numbers of where we're going, this is what it would take in the ways that we're doing things. But if you get under that and you go here in Perth, for example, if I can remember the specifics, I think I mentioned them to him though at the time. I went and looked it up to be sure I was saying the right thing. But it's something like the vast majority of structures house 3 to 5 people. Most places have like 1 to 2 or maybe 3 in them and decreasing. So what are we doing? And a lot of these big high rises, there's vacancies coming out of our ears because they're investment vehicles, not living places. They're not homes. So a lot of this, if we really want to get to the heart of the matter, comes down to the commoditization of food and housing instead of sustenance and relationships and homes, right? That ultimately we have to face this down. We have to get back to these first principles. And again, this is part of what we can do with each other as part of shifting the systems and stories. But in that context, we don't need the 8 New York cities, and no matter what beautiful green material they're made of. And the same is true of the renewable energy transition. We can't, mustn't, and don't need to simply aim to swap out the energy level we're at right now. We waste 2/3, perhaps more, of what we generate right now. And that is a beautiful opportunity to make our renewables that we can generate sustainably match the energy output that serves us well, that is a healthy, sort of optimal, if you like, level of energy. Yeah. Opportunities everywhere.